Nature has the ability to humble human beings. Even with huge advances in science and technology, extreme weather events and tectonic shifts can prove too great for people to overcome. Though it's rare, nature will occasionally unleash a terrible malady upon an unsuspecting community. From ancient earthquakes to vicious cyclones, we're counting down the top 10 most devastating natural disasters of all time. Number 10. 1976 Tangshan Earthquake. The Tangshan earthquake struck early in the morning of July 28, 1976. Most people were asleep when the earthquake jolted them awake with a 7.6 magnitude blast. Just as devastating was the 7.1 magnitude aftershock that rocked the city only 15 hours later. Though scientific earthquake prediction is in its nascent stages, nature often gives some advance warning of an impending earthquake. In a village outside of Tangshan, well water reportedly rose and fell 3 times the day before the earthquake. In another village, gas began to spout out the water well on July 12 and eventually caught fire. Animals also reportedly acted strange, with forest creatures running hurriedly to find a hiding spot. Once the quake was over, the survivors scrambled out into the open, only to see the entire city leveled. After an initial period of shock, the survivors began to dig through debris to answer the muffled calls for help, as well as find loved ones still under rubble. The death toll? Because China had a very inexact means of calculating, estimates range from 242,000 people. Number 9. 526 Antioch Earthquake. The Byzantine Empire saw its very roots shaken, literally and figuratively, by this massive earthquake estimated at 7.0 magnitude with 18 months of aftershocks and 250,000 lives lost. The earthquake severely damaged the majority of buildings in Antioch, including Constantine's great octagonal church Domus Aurea, built on an island in the Orontes River. Strangely enough, the houses that lay closest to the mountain were the only ones to survive intact. Most of the damage, however, was a result of the fires that raged for many days in the immediate aftermath of the earthquake, made worse by the wind. One of the victims was Euphrasia, the patriarch of Antioch, who fell into a cauldron of pitch being used by wineskin makers. Tragically, only his head remained. The population of Antioch at this time was only 500,000, meaning that more than half of the citizens were killed in the terrible tragedy. Even 1,500 years later, this is still one of the most devastating natural disasters of all time. Number 8. 1920 Haiwan Earthquake. The December 16, 1920 Haiwan earthquake, which registered a 7.8 magnitude on the Richter scale, caused rivers to change course and sent landslides pouring down mountains. The destruction of homes and granaries beneath collapsed hills subjected the initial survivors both to hunger and to exposure to windstorms and snowfall that immediately followed the quake. Vulnerable to bandit activity, many thousands roamed in a deformed landscape that was stripped of its roads and devoid of standing structures and familiar natural landmarks. Post-quake investigations unfortunately do not make it clear what portion of total fatalities may have been due to ground shaking versus landslides, or to starvation or exposure in the quake's aftermath, a subject of much debate. As if the earthquake itself wasn't enough, the following century ushered in a horrible quality of life for many of the people who call this region home. After decades of rebuilding, Haiwan is close to its former glory. Almost exactly 100 years later, this still stands as one of the deadliest natural disasters of the 20th century. 1737 Calcutta Cyclone. The Hooghly River cyclone of 1737 is recorded as one of the deadliest natural disasters of all time. The cyclone, often referred to as the Calcutta cyclone, did widespread damage to the low-lying areas in the region. The cyclone caused a storm surge 30 to 40 feet in the Ganges, with a reported 15 inches of rain falling in a 6-hour period. The storm tracked approximately 200 miles inland before dissipating. In the city of Calcutta, the majority of structures, which were mostly made of mud with straw roofs, were destroyed, with many brick structures also damaged beyond repair. In the Ganges, 8 out of 9 boats were lost, along with most of their crews, and 3 out of 4 Dutch ships also went down. The total death count was 300,000 people. India's Ganges River Delta is prone to tropical cyclones. Additional cyclones with death tolls reported over 10,000 people struck more than 10 times over the next 2 centuries. They are particularly deadly because the Ganges River Delta is so densely populated. 1839 India Cyclone. On November 25, 1839, a brutal cyclone slammed the bustling port city of Karinga in India, tied with 1737 Calcutta cyclone for the second deadliest cyclone in recorded history. This natural disaster also resulted in 300,000 deaths. Strong winds and a 40-foot storm surge resulted in absolute chaos that went on for many weeks. Even after the initial shock, citizens were unable to find clean drinking water or food and perished of hunger and dehydration. Though the port city was hit by a similar storm only 50 years earlier, it only resulted in 20,000 deaths and the city was able to rebound. Sadly, this was not the case for the second Karinga cyclone. The community, once nicknamed Hope Island, was reduced to rubble and was never fully rebuilt. Beyond the human tragedy, more than 20,000 shipping vessels were destroyed, thus ruining the commerce and economy of the city. Those who survived were forced to move on to new communities and attempt to start a new life. To this day, Karinga remains a sleepy fishing village. Tragically, the trauma of the disaster was too great to overcome for its residents. Number 5. 2010 Haiti Earthquake. The only fully contemporary disaster in the top 10, the 2010 Haiti earthquake has ongoing consequences. The island nation of 10 million people was already struggling with severe economic issues when the earthquake struck. So, when the 7.0 magnitude quake hit the capital of Port-au-Prince, the country was entirely unprepared. On top of this initial shock, there were more than 50 aftershocks recorded in the coming days. The government of Haiti estimated that 250,000 residences and 30,000 commercial buildings had collapsed or were severely damaged. The nation's history of national debt, prejudicial trade policies by other countries, and foreign intervention into national affairs contributed to the existing poverty and poor housing conditions that increased the death toll from the disaster. Though official records have been disputed, the Haitian government reported 316,000 fatalities resulting from the earthquake. Not only were many people killed, the disaster also displaced at least 1.5 million people, many of whom still do not have permanent housing almost 10 years later. Beyond this, much of the public infrastructure, from hospitals to schools, is still not operational, creating a much lower quality of life for the people of Haiti. The country is still accepting donations and support from the international community. Number 4. 1970 Bola Cyclone. The Bola cyclone occurred from November 8th until November 13th, starting in the Bay of Bangladesh and moving up toward East Pakistan. It was a Category 4 cyclone in the Saffir-Simpson scale, which means that the average wind speed was between 131 miles per hour and 155 miles per hour. It's considered one of the deadliest weather-related disasters, both due to natural and human causes. This particular cyclone set off a chain of events that started a civil war, created the state of Bangladesh, and created the organization Doctors Without Borders. The cyclone flooded many low-lying islands, effectively drowning the residents, and pummeled the coast with relentless winds that went on for more than a week. In all, 500,000 people lost their lives, and the history of the region was forever changed. The Bola cyclone began with the help of a leftover tropical storm that was breaking up in the Pacific Ocean. This contributed to a tropical depression that formed on November 8, 1970, in the Bay of Bengal. It traveled north from there towards East Pakistan and intensified. By the time it reached land, the cyclone was one of the most powerful in recorded history, and like the other disasters in the Ganges River Delta, it struck a densely populated area. After a botched effort to receive emergency supplies from India, many died of starvation waiting for aid that had already been donated. This still stands as the deadliest cyclone in modern history. Number 3. 1556 Shanxi Earthquake. Officially the deadliest earthquake in recorded history, the Shanxi earthquake occurred on the morning of January 23, 1556 in Shanxi during the Ming Dynasty. The resultant damage across a region stretching for hundreds of miles was extensive, and the loss of life horrific. Although the upheaval lasted only for a few seconds, it leveled mountains, opened fissures up to 66 feet deep in the earth, altered the path of rivers, caused massive flooding, produced massive landslides, and ignited fires that lasted for days. Over half the population of Huazhu was killed, as every single home and building was destroyed in an upheaval that probably registered 8 on the Richter scale. An unbelievable 830,000 people lost their lives in this deadly quake. In addition to significant loss of life reaching into the hundreds of thousands, the earthquake caused significant cultural damage. The small Wild Goose Pagoda, built in 709, lost its top floor and about 6 feet of height. The most significant cultural loss was a collection known as the Tang Stone Classics, a group of 12 early Chinese classic works, about 650,000 characters in length, that were engraved on 114 stone tablets on the orders of a 9th century emperor. 40 of those tablets were broken during the earthquake. Number 2. 1887 Yellow River Flood. The Yellow River is the second longest river in China and, due to its silt content, has been prone to flooding for the entirety of human civilization. As rain began to intensify in the first weeks of September 1887, farmers and workers began to worry. They all knew the legends of errant flooding and fatal overflow of the Yellow River's banks. Those suspicions were confirmed when the river began to flood for 3 months. Owing to the low-lying plains near the area, the flood spread very quickly throughout northern China, covering an estimated 50,000 square miles, swamping agricultural settlements and commercial centers. After the flood, 2 million were left homeless. The resulting pandemic and lack of basic essentials claimed as many lives as those lost directly to the flood. In total, more than 900,000 people lost their lives in this disaster, making it the second deadliest disaster in world history. Number 1. 1931 China Floods. This disaster bears a resemblance to the previous Yellow River floods. China is an example of a very old civilization, and many of China's oldest cities are built near rivers. These rivers have flooded throughout Chinese history, but no year was as bad as 1931. In this year, 3 of China's biggest rivers, the Yellow, Yangtze, and Huai, all flooded. Between the actual floods and the problems they created, somewhere between 1 and 4 million people were killed. Even in a civilization as ancient as China, this became the worst natural disaster ever recorded. Rivers throughout the country rose onto their plains, inundating an area the size of England and half of Scotland combined. Around a tenth of the Chinese population was affected, either by death, injury, or displacement. While the scale of this disaster was exceptional, devastating floods and droughts had become increasingly common in China since the 19th century. Political instability, economic turmoil, and incessant warfare had left the population vulnerable to environmental hazards. In most cases, rural communities bore the brunt of these disasters, but the 1931 flood was so extensive that cities also suffered. Over the past century, China has rebuilt along these floodplains, preparing for the next major natural disaster.